This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Embryos have a 30 to 60% difference in the predisposition to severe diseases. With ORCID, parents can identify their embryo at lowest genetic risk rather than just a random outcome. Our genetic calculator can show the impact of embryo selection. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I'm here today with Dr. Brian Ward Perkins, who is an emeritus professor at Trinity College, Oxford. More importantly, for the purposes of this podcast, Dr. Ward Perkins wrote a book about the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of Rome and the end of civilization. I believe it came out in the year 2005, though I'm assuming the scholarship and the writing predated that considerably. So I read this book. I did read it in 2005. I think I read it like 3 or 4 times since then. Really was a very impactful book for me, and I think a lot of other people. I read actually a bunch of Peter Heather's books right after it. I think Adrian Goldsworthy also wrote a book about the fall of Rome. There was like a boomlet of books in the middle of the 2000s for some reason on the topic. But so it's a topic that interests me, and I think it supposedly interests a lot of people on the internet, according to what they say on Twitter. Although I don't know how deep that interest is. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this conversation. Dr. Ward Perkins, I want to when you wrote the book, you kind of had a prologue where, from what I recall, there was basically a framing question or a revision implicit in the book where a lot of people were denying actually that there was an end of civilization or the fall of Rome. Denial might be too strong of a word, but there was a lot of work on the barbarian transformation, the arrival of the Germans and these sorts of things. And I do remember talking to people who had educations in classics in the United States in the 1990s from elite universities who would explain to me that actually the Roman Empire never really fell. The straightforward explanation is, well, Byzantium, East Roman Empire continued, but also the collapse was overdone. And, the Merovingians were patronizing, basically classical literature after 476, or after, probably more accurately, the fall of, the Ostrogothic kingdom and the Gothic Wars. So this is the context that I recall from that period. Can you talk a little bit about that, why you wrote the book?
Yes. I have worked as an archaeologist as well as a historian. And this revised view of what happened at the end of the Roman Empire is very much a historian's view. I mean, particularly focused on religious history. And if you look at the history of religion, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century is a period of exciting developments and transformation. Obviously, the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and then in the 7th century, the rise of Islam. And I have no problem with thinking that that is an exciting and important thing to study. And in fact, at the moment, I'm working on the origin of the cult of Christian saints. So I'm very much in that world. But if one was an archaeologist, one noticed, and it's just too obvious, that there is a massive material change happening in the 5th, 6th, 7th century. In other words, a decline of the economy of the Roman Empire. So I thought it was important to write a book that sort of that put this different point of view, namely that something actually quite dramatic did happen in those centuries, and that it wasn't all good. as you say, in the Eastern Empire, in fact, I mean, there is continuity because Byzantium goes on until 1453. But in the West, there is a dramatic change. I mean, in fact, no one's going to deny that the Roman Empire fell because by the 6th century, the Roman Empire in the West fell because by the 6th century, Romans are no longer ruling it. It's being ruled by people who've come in from outside the empire. And furthermore, the Western Empire has disintegrated into lots of little states. So no one can deny that. The issue really is whether that was a dramatic transformation for the worse or just a sort of quiet slippage into a slightly different type of world. And I thought the view amongst historians needed a bit of correction.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the great thing about your book is, as you said, you present like the material evidence is very striking. So I think the one example that I like to quote to people is the pollution in British ponds. Now, pollution is bad, obviously, but it is a signature of activity. And what you reported, I think there's been follow-up work that's confirmed this actually, follow-up scientific archaeological work, that the pollution in British ponds did not match Roman era levels until the 18th century, right?
Oh, no, to be precise, what I looked at was this is cores in the Arctic detecting air pollution.
Oh, okay. And like presumably that's from Northwest Europe.
It is assumed to be, because I don't think anybody's suggesting that in North America there is a massive amount of metalworking, nor in Northern Asia. So it is almost certainly coming from the Roman Empire. And there is a spike.
Yeah. And so basically, you're showing in the material record that it took a really long time for some aspects of material civilization to get back to the West Roman peak.
Yes. It's I mean, it's obviously difficult to tell, and you can argue it in different ways. But if you took things like basic products like pottery, and pottery we know an enormous amount about because it's preserved very well in the soil. So archaeologists find it with absolutely no difficulty. And furthermore, one can tell just from a tiny piece of pot the material standards of manufacture. I mean, whether the clay's been carefully sifted, whether it's been fast wheel turned, whether it's been fired in an industrial type kiln, and obviously, whether it's brittle or whether it will actually hold water. And Roman pottery is tons and tons and tons of it are produced, and it's shipped all over the Mediterranean and indeed up into Northwest Europe. There is a very large industry that just goes. I mean, nobody's going to deny that. I mean, it is impossible to argue that continues into the 6th, 7th century. There's a tiny bit of continuity, but just the sheer quantities decline massively. I mean, if one works as an archaeologist in the Roman period, dealing with the quantities of stuff is a major problem. You have to, as it were, collect it, wash it, sort it, label it, store it. Whereas if you're working in 6th, 7th century, you don't have that problem at all. Your problem really is sort of finding things and finding material that's actually datable.
Okay, so yeah, this is obviously not something that a regular person would have experience with. So it was great that you wrote about it because, as an archaeologist, it's just viscerally obvious, right? You just see it with your eyes when you look at the layers. So I guess one question that I have, so I know that, there are some Christian thinkers, I mean, in some ways, I think maybe St. Augustine's, City of God was like early prefiguring it, but the idea is actually the Roman Empire wasn't that great and it was leading to something greater with Christianity. So I can see from that perspective ideologically why some thinkers would, maybe not overemphasize the fall of Rome as the end of civilization, because obviously for much of the period of the Roman Empire it wasn't Christian. But there's a lot of modern people, the late antiquity, some of the people who really study late antiquity, it seems, have also been underemphasized. I don't see it, it's not a real ideological, from what you have said earlier. It's not an ideological issue here. It's basically methodological and disciplinary, do you think, in terms of just what they're focusing on, what they see?
I think largely, there is an ideological issue because empires are very much out of fashion. And I think, rightly out of fashion. So, I'm no exponent of modern imperialism, but an argument that the Roman Empire actually worked quite well, that it gave peace and security, that it encouraged economic growth, that there was a single currency, that the Mediterranean was a peaceful lake. And actually, crucially, which we could discuss, there's very little evidence that the political elites actually wanted to get out of it, is a bit out of fashion. Empires these days are bad. All empires are bad. And I think that, there's absolutely no doubt that the imposition of the Roman Empire was brutal and people fought it passionately. People like Boudicca in Britain were, desperate not to become part of the Roman Empire. But by the 4th century, those kind of sentiments have settled down. And nobody's saying, it's a benign state. It was a slave state, and it was brutal. But it wasn't necessarily worse than what followed. Let's put it that way. And I think that there is a current trend, against any view that an empire is a good thing. And in fact, you can get condemned on it, or in social media for sort of suggesting that any empire might actually have been slightly better than what followed. So I think there is an ideological element to it, although that certainly wasn't what motivated me. What motivated me was the realization that methodologically, if you looked at the archaeology, it just didn't stack up. That there's a sort of quiet transformation, something much more dramatic had happened.
Yeah, so I guess, you're talking about archaeology and this unified currency and whatnot. It brings me to a question, and I have this somewhere in the notes here, about just a model that I've seen some economic historians promote, which is basically this Malthusian model where you have increased productivity, but that's always eaten up by increased population. And so before, say, the 19th century, maybe a little earlier, the Netherlands, here and there, you could think of most people across all of human history as living at approximately the same level, whether they're a Roman peasant or a forager in Southeast Asia, or, a British peasant in the 16th century. Obviously, it's not like totally exactly the same. There are differences, but this idea is that this consumer surplus just didn't exist before the modern era. But then I read some of your work, and then also Kyle Harper's work, The Fate of Rome, and it does seem like the Roman Empire, when you compare it to what happened, or the Western Roman Empire, what happened in the post-Roman states, there was an economic system, something that Adam Smith would recognize in terms of specialization, trade, gains and efficiency, and there were some consumer goods, like pottery, maybe glass, other things that were accessible to, obviously not the slaves or the poorest, but to a reasonable number of Roman citizens that were no longer feasible after the collapse because those systems of economic exchange disappeared. What do you think about what I just said there?
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. What we can't really tell is issues like nutrition. Did they have access to more food in the Roman period? That's very difficult to tell. Potentially massive amounts of work on skeletons might give one a better picture on that. And equally, it's very, very difficult to be clear about population levels in terms of numbers. I think most people do think that in the Roman Empire there were more people and that those people were actually sustained reasonably well than later, but that's almost impossible to prove. But what we can show absolutely conclusively is that when it comes to things that are made, I mean, there are plenty of things in the Roman period that just don't exist afterwards. Well, I mean, things like iron nails. The Romans, iron nails are really useful because they enable you to bang two bits of wood together very, very fast. They're extraordinarily basic things, and you don't make any money making a single nail. You've got to make, hundreds or thousands of them. And the Romans turn them out in vast quantities. I mean, nails pretty much disappear. And also, I mean, we've talked a bit about pottery. I mean, pottery is basic for cooking and also for storage. This is in a world that didn't have much metal, didn't have that much glass, and certainly, of course, didn't have plastic. So, pottery is kind of essential. And for instance, it's been argued, and I think rightly, that in post-Roman Britain, people had to change their cooking habits totally because they no longer had well-made pots that could resist fire and therefore that you could stew meat in. They actually had to sort of completely rethink how they operated. So it's not just that you've lost the thing, you've lost a whole sort of technology with it. But the other things that, along with pots, that I like, because they're really basic things, is bricks and tiles. In the Roman period, brick and tile is ubiquitous. Well, not quite ubiquitous, but it is very, very widely available. And in somewhere like Italy, if you do what's called a field survey, in other words, you walk over ploughed fields looking for ancient sites, Roman sites show up incredibly straightforwardly by a great scatter of brick and tile across the landscape. That all goes. I mean, that's not in. Well, when I say all goes, 99% of it goes. And equally, things like flooring materials, early medieval normal houses have wooden or beaten earth floors. They don't have tiled or stone floors. I mean, they're much more difficult to find as a result. And early medieval archaeology is dominated by post holes. In other words, by the holes that timbers have left. I mean, it is a very different world. And if you've worked on I was partly influenced by working on an archaeological site in northern Italy in a town called Luna, which is up in modern Liguria. It was a major Roman town, a major exporting centre for marble, because Luna marble is what's now called Carrara marble. I mean, that it's the major white marble coming out of Italy. And it's a big place in the Roman period. And we excavated a site on the Forum of Luna. And this is a 6th century site. The marble paving of the Forum had all been robbed out, and it had been taken down to just the cobbles underneath the cobble sort of settings for the marble. And the whole thing had silted over. And on top of that were some very humble timber buildings. It's a big, big change. Now, that's arguably at the extreme end of change, but that's not untypical of what you find in the post-Roman period.
So I guess the question that I have is, you said the early medieval period, sometimes it's called the Dark Ages, whatever. Let's say before like 1000 AD, give or take. It makes sense, all the stuff you're saying. When would you say that you're starting to see some parity with what you saw in the Roman Empire in, say, like, let's say the Low Countries? I don't know if you know that archaeology well. You could say Northern Italy, since you know Northern Italy. When are we back to some level of parity? I just want to know from your archaeological perspective.
Okay, it's difficult. I think there's no doubt that by 700 AD, you get the very beginnings of economic growth again. In other words, the very earliest new trading towns, places like Venice in Italy or Southampton in Britain. They're tiny places initially, but that is the sort of the beginnings of I mean, in a sense, that's the end of the recession, because as you probably know, a recession, the end of a recession is not when you get back to the previous level. It's just when you stop going downhill again, and you're actually beginning to climb up. When do you get back to a situation comparable to the Roman Empire? I don't think it's before about 1000 at the very earliest. And in terms of things like pottery industries, probably later than that. Certainly in terms of availability of coinage, Romans produced copper coins in huge quantities. A Roman copper coin of the 4th century, you can buy a very nice one for extremely little money. I mean, you can get one for $10. I mean, the reason for that is because they're so common. They were produced in their millions. You don't get that until very, very, very much later. Then you're talking in the sort of 16th, 17th century. I mean, whether copper coinage is is a good index of economic growth is, you could question. And in terms of sort of solid building, I mean, obviously by the 11th century, you'll get some massive cathedrals, which are, on a Roman scale. So I would have said not really till 900, 1,000 at the earliest.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. I appreciate you putting some values there, because it gives those of us who are not archaeologists much better intuition about this sort of thing, because it's difficult, we only see the most magnificent, you know what I'm saying, buildings and whatnot, so it can be a little difficult sometimes. So what was the most surprising empirical result that you reported in your book, just over the years? Like, what was the most surprising thing for you?
Well, I suppose actually it's a difficult question, because in a way I wasn't surprised by what I wrote, because it seemed to me so obvious, and still seems to me so obvious. I suppose what surprised me most is the fact that, people didn't seem to notice that there's actually something quite dramatic happened at the end of the Roman Empire. I mean, actually, I was born and brought up in Italy, in Rome. So, the idea that the Romans could do things on a grand scale, and not just, it's not just imperial buildings. I mean, the key thing is that they have little houses in the countryside which are solidly built with tiled roofs and with good quality pottery. I mean, these are ordinary farmers who have access to this kind of material. So I mean, in a sense, that's in my blood from the beginning to sort of know that. So in a way, for me, the surprise is the fact that one has to somehow argue that actually, the Roman Empire was economically considerably more advanced than what happened afterwards.
So I guess, I mentioned Peter Heather earlier, and he's written this multi-volume series. I think it's going into the medieval period now, on like European history. But he started, I think, with a trilogy, The Fall of Rome and The Barbarians, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like your book, from what I remember, it seemed like very, very dense on the descriptive detail, the data, what Romans produced and what stopped getting produced. Whereas Peter Heather's book is more of like a traditional narrative history of these, political goings on, although there's some archaeology in there too. He talks about, I think the first book he talks about the Roman expansion into Germany. Like, it just doesn't make any sense in a fiscal sense, because you look at the German economic state and it was just not, viable to actually be productive or profitable. But how would you contrast your guys's work, your book? You have this one primary book that made a huge impact. Heather has been like continuing, although I think his earlier books, candidly, probably made the biggest splash.
Sure. I mean, Peter is an almost exact contemporary of mine. He's a little bit younger. We know each other very well. He lives just outside Oxford, where I live, and so I'm very familiar with his work. I mean, I think you've put your finger on it. I mean, he's basically a political and military historian primarily, although he's just written a big book on the rise of Christianity. I'm not really, I'm less interested in the politics and certainly much less interested in the military side of it. So I'm in my book. I mean, my book there's a first half which does discuss the military and political change, but I'm much more interested really in the second half, which is about the consequences of the change and the changes to material culture and to the economy. I mean, that's the basic difference. And Peter's never worked as an archaeologist. I mean, we're in just slightly different fields. I mean, I substantially agree with everything he says, but we're working in just slightly different areas. And I mean, Peter wouldn't claim to be an economic historian, which I would say I was.
Okay. Well, so since we're on Peters, I asked some questions on social media, what people would be curious about. So some of these are from them. Peter Brown, he has like a lot of great work on late antiquity. Sometimes people have contrasted your book with the late antiquity studies. I've read a fair amount of Peter Brown stuff. I feel honestly it's more complementary or adjacent as well. But what would you say? What would you say to that?
Yes. I mean, I think I'm putting a different point of view because I mean, Peter Brown is very much about his world of late antiquity, which goes from sort of 250 up to sort of 750, is all about sort of growth of new ideas and transformations. I mean, it's a brilliant book. I mean, particularly because it brings in Persia and Islam and sweeps it all into one great new period. And it's a fantastically skillful book, and he is a brilliant historian. But it's certainly true that my book's partly a reaction against that. I mean, putting just a different point of view, specifically about what happened in the West. I mean, saying that's all fine. And if you look at religious history, it makes perfect sense. And as I said, I am actually now working precisely in that area. And, there are more and more saints. I mean, there's no recession when it comes to saints. And there's no recession when it comes to, people converting to monotheism. I mean, all of that absolutely booms in this period. But if you happen to look at things like pots and tiles, there's quite a big change. I have been accused of being obsessed by pots. I'm proud of that. I don't mind that at all. I mean, I'm perfectly prepared to admit that I think, an interest in the real basics of daily life is fundamental. And in fact, as I say in my book, we all just take them for granted. I mean, we all take it for granted that we sit in nice, comfortable houses with heating and a laptop where we can discuss things across the Atlantic. But I mean, all of those things actually are an achievement, and they are fragile. I mean, one of the things I do say in my book, and I think it's important, is that one of the reasons why there's such a dramatic change in the 5th, 6th century is because the Roman Empire was a complex economy. People depended on being able to buy their pots from hundreds of kilometers away, and they depended on specialized producers who were able to make this stuff and then ship it. I mean, despite the fact that it's something like a pot, easy to break, and you don't make a lot of money selling one pot. So, I mean, you need a complex whole world industry of production and diffusion. But because it's so complex, it can unwind. And at the very end of my book, I do warn us that we do live in a fragile world. I mean, I sincerely hope that our world, goes on becoming more and more complex and more prosperous and brings more and more people into a situation of comfort. But it depends on this kind of economy, which is fragile.
Yeah. Exogenous. I mean, we know this with supply chain shocks, which we already experienced a big one in the last 4 years, and we might experience another one soon with the stuff that's happening in the, Gulf of Aden, plus the Panama Canal is drawn down due to a drought. I have a question relating to taxation, I guess, taxation and monetization. What do you think of Chris Wickham's work about late antiquity and the early Middle Ages? And that, from what I recall, his argument is one of the biggest changes is the post-Roman societies really could not mobilize and coordinate resources in the same way because they did not have the fiscal apparatus of the Roman state to actually, sequester productivity, money, taxation in the same way. They were poor.
Yes. I mean, Chris is quite optimistic about the post-Roman period. I'm more pessimistic about it than he is. I mean, again, Chris is somebody I know very well. We're more or less contemporaries as graduate students. But he's undoubtedly right that there is a dramatic shift. Because something I don't discuss in my book, but which is very, very important, is that in the Roman Empire, you've got specialized production, but you've also got specialized function when it comes to administration. And in particular, you have a professional army. You have people who are soldiers all the time and who are paid a salary. And that requires a taxation system that gets the money out of people in order to pay these specialist workers, soldiers. And the main drain on the Roman finances, unquestionably, was the army. In the post-Roman period, that just goes. I mean, to say there are no professional soldiers might be a slight exaggeration because the kings probably had, a small group of people around them. But basically what happens is a massive change. The aristocracy and everybody who's free has to become a part-time soldier. In other words, you're moving into the medieval world. I mean, the medieval world is characterized by people who own land and fight. And if you're a male who owns land, you are also a fighter. In the Roman Empire, that was the case at the beginning, but by the late Empire, completely different. I mean, there are people who, wouldn't know how to use a sword. If you put them one in their hand, they pay their taxes and somebody else does the fighting. I mean, arguably, it wasn't a terribly good idea because they paid a load of Germanic people to do it. And sometimes those Germanic people took over power, but it was a completely different world. I mean, and that there, actually, you don't really get back to the Roman Empire till the 16th century. It's really only in the 16th, 17th century that aristocrats, and even then, they're still sort of expected to fight, even into the 18th century. So, yeah, I mean, there's a huge change. And it's a social transformation of a dramatic kind. And again, that's the sort of thing that isn't discussed in something like Peter Brown's work. I mean, that's not a criticism. It's a different type of work about a completely different area of history.
Yeah, I mean, depending on what you're looking at, you can emphasize ruptures or you can emphasize continuities, right?
Yeah.
And for the popular audience, I feel that, until relatively recently, continuities were not emphasized, so it seems kind of a revolutionary or an interesting thing that you could talk about and think about. Oh, this whole fall that we read about in 476, etc. But sometimes things can be taken a little too far, and I think that's your perception definitely what happened, and then you wrote the book, and I think it brought some things back into line. I want to ask you, have you read or are you familiar with Walter Scheidel's book Escape from Rome?
Yes, I actually had to review it. And can I just go back to that question about, I mean, actually, ironically,
Sure.
when I wrote my book, a lot of people said, oh, I mean, they were surprised really to find that there was a revisionist view about the end of antiquity as a slightly more positive thing. I mean, the world in general, uh, hasn't moved on from the idea that the end of the Roman Empire was something quite dramatic and possibly quite a bad thing. So in a way, I'm, with the wider tide. I mean, my book was really very much a revision of
Of
historians' views
yeah,
rather
revision of
than.
revision in a way, right?
Yeah, no, and for instance, I mean, when I gave talks in Italy about it, the Italians all said, "Oh, but what are you saying? It's obvious." But anyway, sorry. But to go back to Walter Scheidel, yes, it's very interesting. But I mean, he argues that the breakup of the Roman Empire is a very good thing because it creates multiple states, and those multiple states compete. People within those states compete with each other, and that leads to innovation, technological development, and generally lots and lots of good things in Europe, and explains why Europe becomes the dominant power in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. I actually think it's a nice idea, and I don't have anything against it, and I think it maybe works for the 15th, 16th, 17th century. I mean, the main problem is that there was 500 years from about 500 to 1,000 when it's uh, not a positive thing at all. So as long as if he'd built that in and said, there's a massive recession followed then by interesting developments, which are quote unquote positive, I'd be fine with it. I mean, I think it's actually quite an interesting idea. I mean, obviously, to study it in more detail, you'd have to have I mean, and I don't, you'd have to have a clearer idea about what's happening in China, because, was it the fact that China remained a unified state that prevented its development? And I don't know. And obviously, China today is showing that you don't have to be disunited in order to
Yeah.
take over technology and military power. So one could argue if the Roman Empire had gone on, they'd have been building spacecraft in 1500 because they'd had peace. But you could argue it either way.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's an. I thought it was an interesting and attractive book if it had built in a sort of 500-year recession.
Yeah, I will say, I read the book and it was great. And it's, this is an argument that's been kind of floated before, so it's not a shocking argument. But one of the arguments for why the United States is so economically productive and powerful is that we are a massive common market with a single currency and, free trade. We
Yeah.
don't actually, we're not like the Netherlands or even to a lesser extent Britain. We're not actually very dependent on external trade, like on the margin, but we're mostly an internal economy and we have massive returns to scale. And we have these little centers of, I mean, really, most of the innovation is happening in Boston, San Francisco, half a dozen cities in this country. It's not the vast, swath of the United States. So it's just interesting how we don't have these centralizing problems, but China or the Roman Empire did. So I don't know. It's just interesting to think about the contrast there. It seems very persuasive, but then when you look at other examples, I'm not totally sure. But I mean, I thought it was
Yeah,
an
no, I
interesting.
mean, it's also true that people discuss, and it's not an area of expertise that I have, but how innovative the Roman Empire was is a big topic at the moment. I mean, the old traditional view is it was a slave economy, so you didn't really need to do anything. Instead of inventing the vacuum cleaner, you had a slave, and that's obviously is true up to a point. But they certainly developed things like, port facilities, boats, the technology of producing things like brick and tile, and also a degree of mechanization, particularly for cutting stone, and a degree of the use of water power. There's this extraordinary site in southern France, in what was then southern Gaul, which is a series of water mills down a hill slope. So I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's something that people are thinking about. It's not dramatic, but there are people who would argue. And I mean, there are certain things like, concrete technology, for building, which was certainly, a new innovative discovery and created by the Romans. So, I mean, that's something it's not necessarily the case that the Roman Empire just didn't do anything because you had a load of slaves.
Well, so I have just a question about skill and knowledge. So obviously, economies of scale, free trade, like this is like vast internal market. You can have like production centers, and obviously you could, with the Mediterranean and all that, you can like ship pots everywhere. Okay, I get that. I remember watching a documentary about the Duomo in Florence,
Yes.
like a decade ago, and the Brunicelli, I think, and all that. Part of it was there was a skill supposedly lost from the Roman period, like knowledge that was lost about how to construct some of these domes and whatnot. Do you have any understanding of that? Like how much of just like basic construction skill was lost? I mean, like roads, like Roman roads, some of them are still used in Britain apparently today. Seems like probably like,
Yes, when I said was using Roman roads, I mean the roads are on absolutely the same line. I mean, obviously we've got tarmac, and it's quite a substantially different. Yes, I mean no, quite a lot of skills are lost. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that a stone bridge was built anywhere in the West between, I don't know, 500 and maybe as late as 900. I mean, some wooden bridges, possibly, but probably nothing terribly dramatic. And obviously, I mean, things like aqueducts, I mean, that we know for certain just go. I mean, there's a 7th century aqueduct in Spain, which I visited at a place called Recopolis, and that's a royal foundation. And they do build an aqueduct, but it's 2 or 3 kilometers long and is nothing technologically tremendously sophisticated in comparison, to the Pont du Gard or the aqueducts of Rome. Oh yeah, no, a lot of skills just go. Yeah.
okay.
And are only slowly recovered. It's not
Yeah.
true that all skills go. I mean, people did make some bricks and some tiles throughout this period, but though not everywhere. I mean, in Britain, and this is a fact, native wheel-turned pottery disappears in the 5th century. Now, the use of the wheel is the most basic thing. It enables you to produce a pot much faster and with an absolutely even body. Disappears. Similarly, kilns disappear. What they're doing is they're making hand-shaped pots. I mean, sometimes quite beautiful, but not terribly functional. And they're firing them in what are politely called clamps. And a clamp is just a bonfire. In other words, you put your pot in the middle of it and put a load of wood around it and fire it. Kilns go. So yeah, no. There is substantial technological regression.
Okay. What do you think of the hypothesis of lead pipes causing major problems in the Roman Empire?
The answer is I don't know, but I suspect it's probably not very important. But I don't know.
Okay.
Is the simple answer.
Okay. Yeah. It's just something people are asking.
You'd have to do to show it was well. I mean, why does it take so long? B, I mean, I live in a 19th century house that once had lead thing, but I live in a limestone area, so actually the lead pipes are all furred up with limestone in the middle so the lead doesn't get to me. Actually, I think it's now been replaced anyway. But I mean, the main problem is, why does it take so long? Why doesn't it all collapse around 200 as a result of lead poisoning? And obviously, to do work on that, you'd need to do a lot of analysis on skeletons. I don't think anybody's really holding that out as an important cause for the end of the decline of Rome.
Just out of curiosity, have you been tracking the work of geneticists who are starting to look at the Roman Empire? Mostly, I think Johannes Krauss's lab and Max Planck in particular are focusing on it. But there's people like Tom Booth, who I think is starting to go into early medieval Britain, 5th, 6th century, and stuff like that.
No, I haven't. And I obviously I read. I mean, it's an interesting area. I mean, it's particularly discussed in terms of the migration, or whether there was massive migration in the 5th, 6th century. The idea that there was migration, this isn't an area I'm centrally involved in, has, amongst a lot of people, gone out of fashion. I mean, the idea is that, only a few people came, and that really what happened is that the people who were buried with what we would call Germanic grave goods were actually natives who'd culturally changed, rather than be people who were descended from people from outside the empire. And there's been some work on this. Yeah, I mean, the jury's out.
I will. I'll send you after we record this. I will send you some links. You can read because I've written about this. The short of it is, there was a substantial migration in places like Britain, and like there are people who are buried in Eastern England who are genetically North German. Like, they look like North Germans. They do not look like the Iron Age Britons, right? So it's a mix, as you would expect. And like the exact proportion of newcomers is still under argument, whether it's like 20% or 40%. Probably still a minority, but a large number. It's definitely in Britain. It's a large number, and in the Balkans, it's a large number. It's like 50% in the Balkans. The Slavs definitely arrived in large numbers.
I mean, can I say? I mean, I think. I mean, I'd be in general agreement about that. On the other hand, it is also true that if you take Britain, there is also massive cultural change that can't be, I mean, that in a sense happens to native people. I mean, the fact that the Celtic language disappears, the fact that Christianity disappears, and the fact that everybody speaks English isn't because all the natives are killed or driven out. A lot of the natives have Anglo-Saxonized. So, I mean, yes, I mean,
there are some individuals buried with there's one individual I'm thinking of that was buried in a high status Anglo-Saxon grave with pagan, ritual pagan objects, who was genetically an Iron Age Celt. So there are people who assimilated.
People would assimilate. I mean, because the elite are now Anglo-Saxons, so people it would be to their advantage to Anglo-Saxonize. Yeah.
Yeah, so it looks like, if I was going to give a stylized fact, it looks like East Anglia, it looks like the Saxon shore, that was not a nice arrival, but the western half of England, like what used to be Dumnonia, became Wessex and stuff, that was more the cultural aspect. And, as you know, there is some evidence that, Alfred the Great's lineage was mixed or partly Romano-British or Celtic. Just if you look at the names of the early of the early supposed ancestor. So, but anyway, that's like a silent. We've been talking for a while. I want to ask you, because I haven't asked you the big question that people are always asking about. I did ask you a little bit with the lead. Like all of these ideas about why Rome fell. Gibbon kind of threw out Christianity. Peter Turchin has the economic. He's a quantitative historian. Let's put it this way, Cleometrician.
Yeah.
But he has the theory of elite overproduction as why agricultural civilizations rise and fall. I mean, it was inevitably going to end at some point. There's no polity that lasts forever. But it's just the question is when and why. It's probably overdetermined. I think if you read Heather's book, from what I remember, he focuses a lot on contingent events that happen politically. And you look at the Eastern Empire, and the Eastern Empire managed to kind of go through the difficulties of, the 7th, 8th century that come back. There was a resurgence. So, it's possible. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Or do you just like say that's just not part of your, I don't know. I mean, it's
No,
kind of
it's an
speculative,
interesting
right?
topic. I mean, I agree with you entirely. I mean, the first thing to realize is that the one thing we learn from history is that things do not last forever. I mean, that's, very basic. So something is always going to happen. I think the other thing we learn from history is that it's not always predictable. In fact, very often not predictable. But why do I think the Western Roman Empire fell? I do think it's a military explanation, and there is quite a lot of chance in it. I mean, the obvious question is, why does the Eastern Roman Empire survive when the Western Roman Empire doesn't? And I think there's actually a really basic reason for that. The Eastern Roman Empire most of it was protected by the Bosphorus, the little bit of sea that links the Black Sea to the Aegean. And the Germanic people and then the Slavs were not brilliant at seafaring, although the Vandals did become pretty good at it in the 5th century. Because, in fact, in the 4th century, the very end of the 4th century, the disastrous battle, which is the Battle of Adrianople in 378, is actually lost by the East Roman Emperor. And as a result of the Battle of Adrianople, the Balkans are devastated by the Goths. But because of the presence of the great fortress of Constantinople as well, and because of the Bosphorus, the Goths never enter Asia Minor, modern Turkey, and they never get to the sort of heartland of East Roman prosperity. And instead they cross into Italy in 402. And that is disastrous for the West Roman Empire. So I think there's an awful lot of chance. And the other thing about the military situation is that, I mean, the Romans were technically much better militarily in terms of their equipment. I mean, they were able to produce standardized stuff for lots and lots of soldiers, and also probably in terms of their organization, and certainly in terms of their defensive technology. So, in fact, the triple walls of Constantinople are crucial to Roman survival. I mean, the Romans did have a technological military advantage, but it wasn't absolutely overwhelming. It's not like the 19th century when, the West has the Gatling gun, and it's just literally able to mow people down, brutally. In the Roman Empire, it did matter an awful lot getting people out there with a strong right arm able to whack people on the head with something. I mean, the technological advantage wasn't so huge. So it's actually perfectly reasonable to argue that if the Germanic people became a bit more unified, or were pushed into the empire from behind and were forced to be unified, and if there were civil wars going on, it was possible for things to go from bad to worse. And it's also important to remember that in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire pretty nearly completely collapsed, and could easily have collapsed. We could be talking about the 3rd century change and not the 5th century change. In the 3rd century, they happened to pull it together again. And there's no obvious reason how or why they did it. They just did. Possibly the 5th century, they could have done the same. They just didn't. So I think it's a military fact, and there's an awful lot of chance and bad luck. But it's also crucially the fact that really the sort of military forces, then the Romans don't have overwhelming military force.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, well, and when we're talking about like wealth differences, they were wealthier, but it's not like Britain in 1880 versus Africa,
No,
where there's just like
absolutely not.
just vast chasm. And like you're saying Gatling gun, like all of these are presupposed on an industrial base that allows you to just overwhelm other nations or other societies, and that was not true in the pre-modern world where there was more parity, right? Or the small
Yes.
marginal
Yeah, yeah,
differences.
yeah. I mean, obviously, the gun makes a big difference. With well, I mean, the conquistadors in Central and South America, I mean, comparatively small numbers of them, uh, achieving, extraordinary, brutal success.
Well, so I mean, you're talking about saints earlier, so you're obviously interested in, Christianity's effect on the culture. There's all these obviously ideologically freighted discussions about the role of Christianity hastening or slowing down, uh, the fall of Rome. Like, what is your opinion on that? Do you think that's just like this is like a totally separate question? It's a totally separable dynamic, or it has something to do with anything?
Oh, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose one of the crucial things to realize is that the East Roman Empire, which does survive, becomes more and more Christian and more aggressively Christian and does very well out of it. So, I mean, Justinian is super Christian, but he's dominating the East. And in fact, he's even reconquering quite a lot of the West. So you can't just put it down, to Christianity being a bad thing in terms of imperial survival. I mean, on the other hand, it is worth realizing that it may have made a bit of a difference because the church did get more and more property in the fourth, fifth, and sixth centuries, and the church was very, very good at avoiding paying taxes or providing resources for the state. So maybe it made a bit of a difference. But
Yeah.
when we look at the East Roman Empire, it shows that it's not a single explanation. It might be a partial explanation in terms of resources going into resources which are then inefficiently taxed going into ecclesiastical hands.
Yeah, just a minor note on that. The Chinese system, the persecutions of religions were quite often, most of the time, actually not based on anything ideological or belief oriented. It's just when say the Buddhist monasteries had sequestered so many of the resources that the bureaucrats started freaking out that, it's starving the state. And so they would basically go full Henry VIII on them. This happens periodically. They will just like force a bunch of monks to re-enter the economy and confiscate the temple. So, this is a general thing that happens in a lot of societies, and there's various ways you deal with it. As you said, the what we call the Byzantines, the East Roman Empire, they seem pretty good at fusing the church with the state and the society to create this kind of like ideological political complex. Although they did have their conflicts with iconoclasm and other things, so it caused a little bit of tension here and there. But I think that's true of all societies. So as we're closing out, I want to ask you. Name some books about the Roman Empire. Like, let's do five books about the Roman Empire that you like. Just like
5 books.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'd say is that I don't really know any really good book apart about what's happening at the very end of the Roman Empire, apart from possibly my own book or Peter Brown's book and Peter Heather's books, which we've already discussed. So for the late empire, I think those are, probably the things to read. And if you look, I mean, Peter Brown's World of Late Antiquity is a beautifully produced book with lovely pictures. And it's, I don't say this negatively, it's very seductively written. It's beautifully written. I mean, he's an accomplished stylist as well as an accomplished historian. In terms of earlier, I mean, actually, if one doesn't know anything about it, I would recommend reading a couple of novels. I really like Robert Harris's Pompeii. Which is a detective story, and the detective is an aqueduct engineer. So it tells you about the technology and the society of Pompeii. Obviously, it's fiction, but it's a it's a lovely book. I really enjoyed that, and very old-fashioned. Uh, I really like Rosemary Sutcliffe. She's writing in probably in the 40s and 50s, and she writes a lovely book called Eagle of the Ninth, which is about a Roman Briton who goes up to Scotland in order to recover the lost eagle of the Ninth Legion. It's a lovely book. I mean, it's deeply suspect and
I think they made I think they made a film about that. I think they made a film.
Oh
about
yes,
that
I'm sure they did. And there's a beautiful audio book of it. Anyway, I mean, so I think, if you don't know anything, I'd read those. I mean, I'm also a huge admirer of, I mean, sorry, if one says popular historian, that, can be taken as a negative, but people who are writing for a wider audience. I mean, Mary Beard is bloody good. She deserves her success. And her book on Pompeii. I mean, I think reading something about, what Roman life was like, and her on Pompeii is very good. But her general history, SPQR, is also good. And I'm also a huge fan of Tom Holland, who wrote Rubicon and Dynasty. They're writing for a non-specialist audience, but I enjoy reading them. I mean, you can be quite knowledgeable and really enjoy reading them. And I think Mary Beard and Tom Holland are the obvious people to, get. But they're dead serious. I mean, they're not.
Yeah.
They're not dumbing down, and they're not.
No.
They're not ignorant. They've both done their work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this is definitely a field where there's, you were saying like Peter Brown's a great, prose stylist, and obviously an accomplished scholar. And I definitely think that this is a field where there are a lot of people who could just write and like construct a really good narrative that's also based on, well, we have a lot of textual sources. We have archaeology, as you would say. So there's a lot to work with. So, I think, there's a lot of there's a lot of like, great things out there. You know what? I have like one last thing I want to ask you about. So there was this meme the last year about how like men think about the Roman Empire all the time, and you wrote this book. You've devoted a lot of your life, your thought to the Roman Empire. Um, you know, how does it make you feel when you encounter people and they're just fascinated by what you're doing? I mean, I'm assuming it's positive, but it's also a little strange because you're a specialist, you know so much about these topics, and you obviously have thought a lot about them, and then you have like broad swaths of the public that are making reference to Rome or using it in some argument politically or socially they're making. And do you just try to just withdraw from all of that, or do you say, well, you know what, this is the truth?
Huh. Okay. Sadly, I probably ignore it, but that's probably lazy, and possibly I ought to be taking it more seriously. I'm not terribly. I mean, it may be that in the US, Rome is used more than it is in Britain. I mean, possibly because the US is understandably worried about whether it's kind of declining like the Roman Empire did. I mean, I think in a sense, I think in Britain we kind of got over that because we declined pretty solidly in the 50s and 60s, and we're now at the bottom of the pile and are happy to sit there.
Yeah, I do think it's you're talking about like the crisis of the third century. If Walter Scheidel is correct, perhaps we would be on Jupiter right now because we would have 2 centuries of more economic and technological advancement because those 2 centuries of reunification retarded European development. I don't know, just a funny thought. Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Ward Perkins. I really love the book. Everyone should check this book out. I think I have told people this over the years, but I'm going to tell you guys again. It's an excellent book. It's not that long. I just recommended it actually to a friend, and I will say that this is what I'm gonna say, and this is like not a scholarly thing, but she was messaging me and she's like, I feel like I identify with the barbarians a lot more than the Romans. And so I told her, I was like, why don't you read this book? And then recently she said, yeah, okay, I changed my mind, And I think one thing that I will say is the point is taken that if you're a serious Christian, that the end of the Roman Empire and then the evolution of the medieval period was in a way elevating to the spirit of mankind. But I'm an American, and I will say Americans are very materialistic. And the things you have, the quality of the consumer goods, fundamentally, like they matter a lot to us. And I think when I read your book, it really kind of gave me a different perspective because it showed to me the way the Romans were considerably more like us than, say, early medieval period, insofar as they lived in a world of, integrated economic production of goods and specialization in a way that, where the autarkic manorial system obviously would have been, a bit alien to us. So that was something that I got. And, all the other books that you mentioned, they're great too. And I'll probably put links in the show notes. But thank you for your time. And I will,
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you, those of you who are listening. The book is short, and I may say it took a long time to write precisely because it is short. I'm a great believer in not writing very long books, and it's got lots of pictures in it as well. But anyway, thank you all.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dr. Ward Perkins. Even if you and your partner are healthy, there's still a chance your child can develop a serious genetic disease. This is because every embryo has new changes not present in either parent. Most of the time, these are benign, but sometimes they can be catastrophic. ORCID's whole genome embryo reports directly screen the embryo and analyze these de novo genetic mutations. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids. This